in Singapore. And I'd like to welcome you to the Decoding Digitalisation webinar 2025, which is our annual event that explores and unpacks critical social issues and policy responses. So in the interest of time, I'd like to just go through the agenda for today. We'll start off with a quick introduction to the issue before I hand over to my colleagues, Amy and Denise, to dive into the two key topics of today. So the first is the impact of scams and scam attempts on Singaporeans. The second is an investigation into the use of AI in Singapore across different social groups. We'll then end up with a panel discussion featuring Nigel Teo from Singapore Her Empowerment and Associate Professor Jason Grant-Allen, who is the Director at SMU's Centre for Digital Law. If throughout today's session you do have any questions, drop them in the chat and we'll endeavour to answer you as best as we can, or alternatively, we'll get back to you in email form. But first, if you've spent any time following the press, social media, government over the past few years, you'd be hard-pressed to have not heard anything about the opportunities and risks associated with digitalisation. In particular, there's been much dialogue about the impact of social media upon youth's well-being, the effects of always-on connectedness on employee burnout, and how assistive technologies could shape a generation's cognitive ability, their creativity, and even their personalities. And for governments, this is clearly one of the most defining issues of our time, balancing this innovation with supporting the well-being of citizens. Now, across the region and globally more generally, governments have taken different stances on digital policy. So things like instating minimum age for social media platforms, a right to disconnect for work, and mandatory bans on smartphones in primary and secondary schools. Among Singaporeans, there's really widespread near universal support for many of these, as you can see up on screen. However, the key question is, are these the right approach? And if they're not the right approach, then what are the best alternatives? So we need to add some nuance into the discussion. As Singapore continues to pursue her highly ambitious digitalisation agenda, all of these issues, including the ones that you can see up on screen, and policy responses must be considered. On top of these, the social issues of scams and the downstream impacts of generative AI loom particularly large. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Amy, who is Director and Lead of our Policy Development and Evaluation Practice, to take us through the first topic for today, the results of a recent survey that we ran that focused on the social impact of scams and scam attempts. Over to you, Amy.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy. I'm excited to share the insights that Verian has gathered on Singaporeans' experiences with scams and scam attempts. Next. But before I go further, I want to ask everyone an honest question. If you receive a message from your bank today informing you that there has been an unauthorized transaction and then inviting you to click on a link to check, will you be able to tell if it is real or fake? So this is the reality that all of us are dealing with now. Here in Singapore, over 51,000 scam cases were recorded and at least 1.1 billion Sing dollars was lost in 2024, which is why the Singapore government has been taking a very proactive whole of society approach to tackle online scams. For example, IMDA partners with telcos to block suspected calls. MHA and the Singapore Police Force Scam Shield app helps to filter out scams, and they are also driving intense efforts in public education. Earlier this month, Singapore also hosted the Global Anti-Scam Summit Asia 2025 as part of the Global Anti-Scam Alliance's mission to bring global governments, financial institutions, and technology platforms together to share knowledge and collaborate to combat scams. But online scams is a fast evolving field, and scammers are utilizing generative AI and employing ever new, and innovative impersonation tactics that are harder to detect. So my goal today is to share the data that we have and then make evidence-based policy recommendations to help strengthen Singapore's defense against online scams. Okay, next. And I will briefly explain the sample composition of our survey. So in June this year, Verian sampled or surveyed 1,020 Singaporeans online. That covers the 5 regions in Singapore. And our raw sample was very close to the population makeup, and any small gaps were corrected with weights. So all the results that I'll show are weighted to population. Hence, we are confident that these data provide a robust and nationally representative view of Singaporeans' exposure to and perceptions of scams. I want to highlight that this sample composition is the basis for the findings that I'm sharing, and also the findings that my colleague Denise will be sharing later. So next slide, going into the survey results. Yes, we see that in the past 12 months, almost 2/3 of Singaporeans have experienced either an actual scam or a scam attempt. And this is coming from 21% who indicated they had experienced the scam and 44% who faced attempts. And we also see that this risk isn't uniform. There was significant variance in scam or attempt prevalence according to the demographic subgroup. So we find that scams are higher among Singaporeans between 25 to 44 years old, and also higher among Indian Singaporeans. As for attempts, they are higher among Singaporeans between 45 to 54 years old, and among people with a disability. In contrast, Singaporeans who are 55 and above, they report lower rates of victimization. But here I want to point out that there could be some degree of underreporting of actual official incidents, because we do see from some of our other data points that not everyone makes a report after they get scammed. Okay, so next. Here, this is a very interesting finding. We are looking at the proportion of people who have been scammed in the past 12 months and its relationship with cognitive reflection test scores. So cognitive reflection test, or CRT for short, we had incorporated it into our survey, and it is designed to assess an individual's ability to suppress their intuitive and spontaneous, what we call System 1 response, in favor of the more reflective and deliberative, or System 2 response. So I'll give you an example that we included as a CRT question in our survey. So it's actually the very famous one that you might have heard of, the bat and the ball problem. So a bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost? And very often, people's intuitive response is that the ball costs 10 cents. Yeah. But if we take a more deliberative approach, we will realize that the ball actually costs 5 cents and not 10 cents. So here we tested the interplay between System 1 and System 2 thinking, and we find that people who are very System 1 led, you see that their scores for CRT is lower, which is on the left side of the chart, and their rate of being scammed is also much higher. So that's why you see it skews in that direction, where if you're more compulsive in terms of your thinking, your thought pattern, you rely more on intuition and reflective, thoughts, you're more likely to get scammed. But an interesting thing to highlight here also is that cognitive reflection is not necessarily a wired trait. So it could be that you're in a particular situation where you are stressed out, or you're not in the best state of mind, and therefore you're relying more on your intuitive or impulsive thought patterns, and that that then tend to lead you to be scammed. So it is not necessarily a hardwired intrinsic nature. And this is something that, this is also a dimension that has been looked at in terms of misinformation and disinformation studies. And the same thing has been found. So, and we can see that it applies as well to scams and the likelihood to being scammed. So again, here we want to emphasize that this is something that can actually be overcome with intention and also, the deliberate attempts to pause and think, which is what actually has been in line with the public messaging. Okay, next. Here we see that we're trying to show that scams are, in terms of the types of scams that are most commonly experienced here, we find is that are job scams. They include job scams, e-commerce scams, and also phishing scams. In terms of scam attempts per se, we see that phishing scam attempts are by far the most commonplace. Okay, next. Here we see the what we present here are violin plots, and it's here to help us to visualize the number of times scammed per scammed category. So we are looking at the spread and also the frequency of scam attempts for each scam category. The dots that you see to the left of each of the violin plots, they are the individual survey responses that we collected. And each dot shows how many times a person was scammed in that category. So by looking at these dots, we can see the actual distribution of the data points. And the same information is then summarized by the shape of the violin plots that you see on the left, on the right side of each of the columns. And the shape tells us how often people are scammed. So the wider parts mean more people are had reported that number of incidents. And the median line shows us the typical number of times victims were scammed. For phishing scams, you'll notice that the plot is both wide and the median is high, indicating repeated victimization is common in this category in terms of phishing scams. And the second most common category in terms of repeat victimization, we realize that it is government impersonation scams. Next. Amongst those who faced scam attempts per se, we see that phishing and government impersonation scams, they drive the pressure. So we are talking about averaging of about 5.8 to 4.3 attempts per person in the past year. For online commerce or e-commerce and investment and job scams, they sit around 3 attempts on average. And as for romance and fake friend scams, they are generally lower. So here we want to note the fat tails, right? The fat tails of the plots. Some individuals report 10 to 20 attempts, especially for phishing scams. So unsurprisingly, categories with more attempts, they also account for more actual scams happening. So here we want to highlight that a quick win is to try to choke the attempts of volume in terms of the two top categories, these two top categories of scam categories. Next. Among those who were actually scammed, we are looking at also, we're interested in the actions that they had taken after being scammed. So most acted, however, there are gaps that remain. So we find that 39% filed a police report, 36% contacted their bank, 34% reported on the platform, and 27% actually called or reported on Scam Shield. But the worrying thing is that 1 in 6, close to 1 in 6, did nothing. So the priority here then would be to close the inaction gap and to ensure that victims who have been scammed are making reports and also taking recourse to see what kind of actions or follow-up actions and preventions can be taken in the future. Next. In terms of the protections that are used, we also find that Scam Shield of app is the most highest report usage, leading at 51%, and that's followed by other anti-software or malware, apps or softwares that are being used, and also international call blocking at 22%. But we also see again that 1 in 4 doesn't use any tools at all. So with this non-use of protection tools that is notably high, we realize that it is notably high, especially among people with disabilities. So while Scam Shield take-up is strong, it's among the those who are 55 years old and above and Chinese residents. However, we see that there is opportunity for further activation in terms of protection that is being used. There is opportunity for converting non-users and also making up for easier setup, making sure that they are frictionless, and also tailoring for better accessibility across different user groups. Next. So Scam Shield actually helps. This is what we realize when we assess the impact of protections that are used. So those who actually use Scam Shields were less prone to certain types of scams, in particular, job scams, government scams, and malware attacks. Because we see that users report fewer scams in these areas. However, we also want to highlight that Singaporeans, nonetheless, they still remain prone to other types of scams, such as phishing, which lies outside the boundaries of the Scam Shield, which is the one that is most used so far. So here it's important to highlight that while there are high usage of protection and the impact is good, but then there are also limitations to what the various protections can guard us towards. So the key takeaway here is that it's important for us to layer our defenses to make sure that we don't become complacent with just adopting or using one tool for protection and assuming that it will cover us from all types of scams. Next. And importantly, scams don't just cost money, they impact our well-being. So here, what we can see is that at the top level of the scale, there are significantly lower levels of life satisfaction for those who have either been scammed or who have experienced attempted scams. So you can see that all the way down to 8, 9, and 10. So on the with your top 3 box in the scale is significantly lower for those who have been scammed or experienced scams. That's what we are seeing played out here in this model. So the key thing that we want to point out here basically is that scams affect our impact on our savings and our income, but at the same time, it also impacts our well-being in terms of life satisfaction, in terms of how happy we are, in terms of our general emotional, psychological well-being. And hence, it's important for us to view the effects of scams holistically and recover or attempts or to do damage control or to support scam victims need to go beyond just looking at the economic impact that they have suffered. Next. So very quickly, in the interest of time, I will wrap up the key points that I've highlighted throughout the entire presentation. Essentially, we see that scam it remains a large issue in Singapore, and despite efforts, intense efforts, and whole of society approach, and increasing, public education efforts, more can be done, especially in terms of educating the public about, for example, the pause and think message. That is very much in line with the findings that we have in terms of people relying on those people who rely on their system one thinking. They tend to be, they're also more likely to be or to experience scam victimhood. So that message, I think, can definitely be driven across more firmly and pushed across and cover different aspects of the demographic subgroups. And we also want to make sure that there are targeted, support or efforts driven towards the more vulnerable demographic subgroups that we have highlighted in the presentation, especially for people with disabilities, is especially worrying. And so it warrants further research as well. And also, another point that we want to drive across is that protection against various types of scams, while it is being used and used effectively among Singaporeans, there should be, a clear messaging that just one single protection is not enough, that there should be layered tools to protect us from the various kinds of scams, the different types of scams that are evolving and also becoming more prevalent as the scam field unfolds. So with this, I will pause here and I will invite Denise, who is our Regional Head of Behavioral Design, to take us through the next part of the presentation on perceptions of use of AI in Singapore. Over to you, Denise.
Thanks very much, Amy, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Let's dive straight into the findings, which pertain to Singaporeans' use and perceptions of AI. So before we dive into the findings, let me just share a bit of context. Gen AI has grown at an incredible pace. When ChatGPT launched in late 2022, few of us could have imagined how quickly it would change our lives, from how we work, how we learn, how we connect with each other, and even how we think about our roles in the world. And Singapore has set out clear ambitions through the Smart Nation and national AI strategies to harness AI for the public good. But what does this actually mean for all of us in practice, and how do we keep up? How do we get it right? So that's why we ran this study, to understand how Singaporeans are using AI, what they think about it, and where the risks and vulnerabilities might lie across different groups and across different use cases. Next slide, please. So let's jump into some of the key insights that we found. First of all, AI isn't niche anymore. 3 in 4 Singaporeans have used an AI tool in the past year. Chatbots, unsurprisingly, are by far the most common, with nearly 60% having used them. And for most people, chatbots are how they first get started with AI. But other tools are gaining ground. So about a quarter of Singaporeans have tried AI image generators or personal assistants in the past year. And with new tools, use cases, and models being released at the pace that they are, we can expect these numbers to shift substantially in the coming months and years. Next slide, please. So let's zoom into the specific platforms people are choosing. As a first mover, ChatGPT still dominates, with 67% having used it in the past year. But you can see that Google's Gemini, Microsoft's Copilot, and the Chinese startup model DeepSeek are catching up. And many users aren't just sticking to one tool, they're experimenting to see which ones meet their needs. And that's a sign of how fast this whole space is moving, and how people are open to trying new platforms and switching around. Next slide, please. So we know AI is everywhere now, and people are experimenting with different tools, but who's benefiting the most? Who's at risk of being left behind? And our data shows a clear gender divide. So men are more likely than women to use productivity tools, things like AI personal assistants, automation tools. And why does this matter? It's because these are the tools that help you work faster, they clear routine tasks, and they free up bandwidth for us to do higher value work. So if men are using them more, they're the ones who are more likely to be seen as efficient, productive, and ready for bigger opportunities. Moving on. Men are also engaging not just with the most visible platform, i.e. ChatGPT, but they're also experimenting more across the ecosystem. So while most people use ChatGPT, men are significantly more likely than women to also be using Gemini, Copilot, or DeepSeek. And that gives them more exposure to a wider range of features and use cases. It also means that they're quicker to pick up new capabilities as they emerge. And in the workplace, this can translate into being seen as more digitally confident and the one that colleagues turn to for advice or to test out new tools. And as AI becomes more baked into our everyday work, being seen as that go-to person can make a real difference for career progression and leadership opportunities. Next slide. When we look at chatbot use specifically, men are using them more to be efficient at work. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to use them for job prep, things like writing CVs or preparing for interviews. And both uses are valuable, but the payoffs are different. So using AI to boost efficiency in your current role can result in quicker benefits to performance and to pay. Using it for job prep might pay off down the line, but it doesn't deliver the same short-term boost. And if these patterns that we see across male and females continue, then they risk reinforcing existing gender inequities in the workplace. Next slide. We also see clear differences in by age. So younger Singaporeans, those aged 16 to 24, are using chatbots very differently from those who are 25 and above. So they lean heavily on AI, not surprisingly, for education, making their schoolwork more efficient, getting quick answers on complex topics, and summarizing long texts. But it goes beyond academics. So young people are also using chatbots more to inspire new ideas and for personal and emotional support. So whether that's seeking relationship advice or confiding about their struggles. So for younger people, chatbots are a multi-purpose tool. They're part tutors, they're part brainstorm partners, and they're part emotional confidants. Next slide. We can see that same pattern of using chatbots for personal support showing up amongst persons with disabilities. So for many, AI chatbots aren't just an efficiency tool, they're companions. PWDs are twice as likely to turn to chatbots for emotional support or to lift their mood. And that suggests that AI is filling a real a need gap, especially where other forms of support might be harder to access. But it also raises risks. Internationally, we've seen cases like with character AI, where people form deep emotional reliance on chatbots or where advice given wasn't safe. And sometimes this has led to quite tragic consequences. So for vulnerable groups, that line between helpful and harmful can blur very quickly. And that's where policymakers and product need to have basic duty of care measures. Things like clear guardrails on sensitive topics, visible handoff to human help, and also safer defaults. Next slide, please. So we've seen that most Singaporeans are now using AI tools, whether that's to boost productivity or creativity, or even to receive emotional support. But how do they actually feel about AI overall? The picture is mixed here. So 60% say AI helps them do their job better, but half of them worry about being replaced by AI, and nearly as many are concerned about false information and growing social divides. So high adoption hasn't actually led to peace of mind. If anything, it's made that people even more conscious of the risks. When we ask Singaporeans what worries them most about AI, mis and disinformation and the risk of losing jobs come up the most often. But what stands out is the third biggest concern. So almost 4 in 10 are worried that we'll rely on AI so much that our own abilities will decline. We saw earlier that some users, especially those who are younger, are turning to chatbots for practical and emotional support. So this isn't just about losing out on jobs, it's also about losing the skills that make us human, our ability to think critically and creatively, to empathize, and to communicate with each other effectively. And a growing body of evidence and debate warn of the same thing, how reliance on AI can lead to cognitive offloading, where we outsource more and more of our thinking to AI. And in the process, we weaken our own problem solving and creative abilities. So the real challenge for governments, parents, employers, educators, isn't just making AI available, it's about making sure that people use it in ways that amplify and complement our human strengths rather than replace them. Next slide, please. So people's concerns aren't unfounded. In our survey, 30% say that they've already come across AI giving harmful or offensive responses. And when this happens, it often touches on really sensitive issues, ethnicity in particular, but also class and gender. And in our current environment that feels increasingly polarized, and especially in a multicultural society like Singapore that prioritizes social harmony, these kinds of responses can reinforce bias, they can erode trust, and they can deepen divides. And that's why the concerns that we saw on the previous slide, they aren't distant hypothetical risks, they're already showing up in people's lived experiences. So let me end with 4 important questions that stood out from this part of our study. The first is, how do we close the gender gap in AI use at work? Right now, men are getting ahead with AI tools and platforms. What would it take for everyone, not just those who are the early adopters, to benefit? Second, where should we draw the line on emotional reliance on chatbots? We're seeing more young people and persons with disabilities turn to AI for support, but how do we protect the vulnerable without losing the good and the value that AI can bring? Third, how do we make sure that AI helps us grow rather than replace us? So people are worried not only about job loss, but also about losing their own skills if they rely too much on AI. So what's needed so that AI strengthens our capabilities and not just our output? And finally, how can Singapore keep trust high as AI risks like misinformation and social divides grow? How do we strike that right balance between openness and safeguards so that we can remain innovative, but do so in a way that is safe and fosters trust? So these aren't technical questions about our AI future, they're very much social ones. So with that, I will hand over to Rob and our panel to dig into some of these questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. So we had a panel discussion the other day, as I mentioned before, with Nigel from SHE and Jason from SMU, and I'll just play the recording now. It touches on many of the issues that Denise brilliantly discussed right now. So thank you for the segue, Denise. Over to our panel. Thank you. It is an immense pleasure to have 2 esteemed panelists join us today for today's discussion on the risks associated with digitalization and emerging technologies such as AI. And I feel that this topic is particularly timely given what's going on in the world at the moment. So given the policy responses undertaken by governments globally, and these responses have really garnered this, I think what's fair to say is a little bit of cacophony of different responses from citizens, ranging from the recent riots in Nepal to widespread support in Australia. But before we get into the crux of today's conversation, I'd like to just start off with a quick round of introductions, starting off with Nigel. So Nigel, could you just spend a quick moment introducing yourself, SHE, as well as the recent areas of focus in your work?
Thanks, Rob, and the team at Verian for this opportunity to be part of this exciting panel. I'm Nigel, a researcher with SG Her Empowerment, a Singapore-based nonprofit that strives for gender equity and equality, right, in the online and offline world. My work involves understanding these issues in the online space, particularly the misuses arising from the use of Gen AI tools and applications. So very happy to be here together with Jason and Rob to talk about these issues.
Thank you. Over to you, Jason.
Wonderful, thank you. And again, pleasure to be here, and thank you for the kind invitation. So my name is Jason Allen. I'm an associate professor of law at SMU Yong Pung House School of Law, and I'm also director of our Centre for Digital Law. And I'm also an adjunct associate professor at the University of Tasmania School of Law, which is my alma mater. So yeah, day in the life. This week, I've been working on a range of things. I've been working on finalizing a symposium issue on AI and intellectual property law. I've been doing the same for a special issue on AI in public administration, which is looking at how we actually operationalize these principles of responsible AI in the specific context of government services and government service delivery in public administration. And a lot of my work recently has been around sort of trade, technology, and the impact of geopolitics and geopolitical fragmentation for an economy such as Singapore. So a fairly mixed bag, which is reflective of, I guess, my role as a center director. And I would note, some of my colleagues, we do have work going on at the center on some of the areas of interest to Singapore, her empowerment and the online harm space. And Jane Liu is a wonderful researcher that we have, as well as Sun Sun Lim, and our Dean Pei Woon Lee has been doing work in this space as well.
Fantastic. So I think no better place than Singapore to be based when you're looking in at this particular area, Jason.
That is true.
I'd like to start off from a kind of really a broader macro perspective, just to get your sense of the kind of scope of the issue. So as you both know, and as the listeners would know, Singapore is one of the most future-facing nations when it comes to digitalization. So it has this kind of ambitious aspiration to become the preeminent smart nation globally. And that's clearly laid out in the Smart Nation 2.0 document that was released last year. So starting off with you, Jason, I think from your perspective, what are some of the key risks associated with this push for digitalization? So what are the key risks that face the little red dot moving towards 2030?
Yeah, thank you. So I think I'll speak to 3 points because this is an excellent question, and I've spent a little bit of time thinking about it. The first one, and this will translate differently in Singapore to any other sort of jurisdiction, but I think generally on a global level, societies around the world, given the dynamics of digitalization, there are two really obvious failure states, and one is kind of pervasive, what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, and the other is digital authoritarianism. And I think that if we just let things go and take their course, one of those two failure states with different national sort of local inflections is what I'd really like to avoid. And that said, there's a range of sort of positive outcomes in the middle as well. But I think key risk number one is lapsing into one or the other of those failure modes. In terms of other points that I'd like to speak to specifically, I think one concern that I have looking over the next 5 years to 2030 is generative AI, particularly interacting with an information ecosystem that we know is already in deep, deep trouble. And you mentioned, for example, riots in Nepal and social media bans in Australia. I think it's becoming increasingly important to ask, well, where are we getting our information from? What's in the information? But also, if content can be created at almost zero cost, which it can now, then the filtering function becomes even more important. And there we have to really ask who's putting that information that we're seeing at the top of the search page. Though it's not a search page, it's a TikTok video feed these days. So that's the second point. The third point relates to AI specifically, but also I think overuse of devices. And I think, frankly, this is a problem everywhere, but it's a big problem in Singapore. The amount of times I've gone to a hawker market and, we talk a lot about Asian values and the family and so forth, and there's a whole bunch of people and none of them are talking to each other. Or you have a zombie in front of you who's just locked into their screen. I think device overuse is an issue. That then compounds with the use of digital tools, and I think Gen AI is kind of illustrative there. I'm worried about cognitive decline and kind of social entropy. I mean, you don't know now whether I'm coming up with these answers or whether I plug them into ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And of course, it's fine if I use ChatGPT as a tool, and we can get into discussions about responsible use and all of that. But what I think is a real failure state is that you're using a chatbot to write me an email. I'm using Copilot to summarize the email. We're all switching off. We're having what look like meaningful interactions, but we're actually disengaging and we're all declining cognitively. So that'd be the three things that I'm most worried about at this point looking towards 2030.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Given the corpus of the internet is largely driven by bot activity as well. There's a lot of that going on. So there's that additional dimension there. How about you, Nigel?
I think it's hard coming from Jason's kind of like overview, and I really agree with most of the points. I just want to build on that very last point, right? Really that idea of not only the cognitive decline, but really the social atrophy of like really how we are not really thinking about Gen AI just affecting our cognitive functions, but really how we relate to each other socially. Right. I think we'll talk a lot more about, especially we delve deeper in the survey results, right, that your team has run with regards to this gender divide on adopting digital tools like Gen AI, or even the emotional reliance on chatbots for companionship. But I think just to build on that point, we also need to think about how digitalization then exposes youth and just the general population about online harms on a much bigger and grander scale.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? There's the cognitive decline, and then there's that dimension. There's a lot of recent work that's been done about how it affects other dimensions of personality, like conscientiousness. So there are broad trends as well as mental well-being and all these sorts of things. So a very complex network of outcomes that are there. So the second point is regarding Singapore specifically, and Jason, you touched on this a little bit, but Singapore has quite the demographic footprint, I guess I'd say, is similar to some of our neighbors from around the region. So Japan or Korea, where we have, obviously a rapidly aging population, low birth rate. What does that also mean in terms of what does this fingerprint or footprint mean for lawmakers, policymakers, and strategists? How do you plan around that in the context of digitalization? And what can we learn from our neighbors in terms of planning, or is it more so that they learn from us here, Jason?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I'd caveat, I'm relatively new to Singapore. I've been here for 3 years, but I studied with friends from Singapore and from this part of the world, and but yeah, not purporting to be sort of a bona fide expert there. I think that we can see some of these demographic trends driving attitudes towards digitalization in this part of the world. I think, it seems that Japan is investing heavily in robotics and automation because they're worried about workforce resilience and an aging population, and because the Japanese have certain attitudes towards, mass scale immigration. So that's one aspect of it. I think obvious talking points would be around digital divide and digital inclusion, and making sure that the services that we provide are appropriate to the whole sort of demographic. And this is something which is, really evident to me. I've seen my mum is 80 next year, and she's using a smartphone and so forth, and even social media, which is slightly concerning. But it's been interesting to watch her coming to terms with a rapidly changing state of the art in terms of digital technology and networked technology, ubiquitous internet and things like this. But she does struggle. And I think that has to have implications for policymakers. I think we can also expect, maybe not in Japan, but we can expect, and I think we're already seeing, we are having demographic changes in response to the aging population through labor market mobility. That's also causing demographic changes, and that will also have implications for how we do digitalization or digital transformation successfully or unsuccessfully. And I think we're also seeing some political differences as younger voters now come online, as millennials start to, for example, assume different positions in organizations, whether, in the private or the public sector. So, yeah, what we can learn from our neighbors, or what they can learn from us, I think Singapore is generally always well positioned because it's a small and pluralistic, but nonetheless fairly cohesive society, with, a particular, like quite a unique, actually, regulatory culture and regulatory apparatus, which means that you can act more quickly on issues here than in some other places. The last point I'd sort of touch on, and it follows on from the last one, but for example, over the last 12, 24 months in Australia, and this is, I think, interacting particularly with the demographic change and differences in politics with younger voters. We've seen conversations around the Gaza conflict, for example, that are, not only very heated, but also we've seen an unprecedented level of anti-Semitism online and offline in Australia. Like that just hasn't been an experience of Australian public life ever, really. And this is also interacting with the way that we consume information and also with Gen AI-driven mis and disinformation. So I think as politics is becoming post-truth, Gen AI and other digital tools are providing new means for sort of post-truth politics and bad actors.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. That kind of tinderbox of nativism and then social media platforms and amplification has really lit in recent times, particularly if you look at even, again, from a timely perspective, there was a right-wing influencer who was assassinated in the United States this morning. So certainly something to look out for. I just wanted to change tack for a moment. And one of the issues that's really been at the forefront of discussion regarding AI and AI adoption and technological adoption more generally is the differences in adoption and usage according to gender. So we're obviously, some way into the adoption of these different technologies like AI and chatbots and so on and so forth. And in the study that we ran, we can see clearly that there are different use cases according to gender. So men use AI to enhance their in-job performance more than women. And they're also more familiar and more fluent across different platforms. So, Nigel, I'd just like to ask you about this. What are the kind of downstream implications of this in particular? What are you concerned about?
Yeah, sadly, these findings that were found in the survey kind of mimic that global trend that you mentioned, right? That women do take up AI tools less than men in general. And especially in Singapore, when we look at LinkedIn research, we know that about 40% of women are in roles that are probably be disrupted by Gen AI kind of tools in the coming years to come. What does this actually mean is that we actually risk seeing this career progression gap between the genders, right? If men are using Gen AI tools more to boost their productivity and performance, they would generally just advance faster, while women risk falling behind in work performance matrices, promotions, and positive work outcomes. This could very well then translate to a widening kind of income gap and opportunity gap that we already see in the different genders, right? Especially if women continue to be concentrated in jobs and careers that will be disruptable by Gen AI, right? Finally, we're really concerned about this issue, which is the biasness that will continue to perpetuate in these Gen AI tools, right? If fewer women are using these tools, then the data that is used to train it, whether it's by the prompts that are put in or the outputs that are generated, will reflect more male preferences, right? And reflect more of these interactions. So this could reinforce the stereotypes that are more male-based and overlook women needs in everything from product design to healthcare advice. So when we look in totality about the downstream implications of this gap of adoption, it's not just about productivity, but it's really about equitability, right? And whether this future in Singapore, as we go through digitalization, is really the same for males and females, right? So we really need to be wary of this. If not, we'll just import all inequalities into this new digital age.
Yeah, I think the interesting dimension there is what's underpinning that slower adoption.
Right.
Because you could also see that there might be a dimension of there is increasing misuse by different actors, particularly from a kind of male lens point of view, from an online safety perspective. Does that impede women's interest in the technology, and does that push them away a little bit more? The other layer of this kind of discussion is that adoption is obviously unlikely to be linear. So there was a very, very interesting study that was recently conducted in the United States. I think the Census Bureau ran it, where they said that use of AI for goods and services is actually slowing in recent times. So how that interacts with some of the gender effects and trends that we've discussed is an interesting one as well. So what we do, as a kind of ecosystem here, I'll open this up to both of you, but what can be done by the different stakeholders to address these kinds of gendered economic issues, and actually just even aside from the economic issues, some of those online safety issues that we've talked about today. Nigel, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I think really when we think about the kind of gap that we see right now, right, I think first and foremost, we need to know how is that gap like locally, right? So I think when we think about where we are at, we probably need to work with tech companies, also with government bodies to really make it a mandate to understand in a disaggregated sense of data, how are the genders taking up Gen AI tools for work in different sectors, right? If we don't understand this problem, we will know how to intervene and to what extent, right? So when we think about the national AI strategy, perhaps we can integrate gender disaggregated adoption data as a part of a mandate for different sectors to kind of report back, and also set relevant targets then based on the baseline data of how that we can encourage women participation in, right? But I guess also for perhaps organizations like myself, NGOs and community organizations, we can also play a role in making sure that women who may be often excluded from formal training pipelines, like mid-career women or lower income women or caregivers, aren't really left behind in this whole journey for digitalization, right? So we can probably do relevant work for training and to provide role models and peer learning groups. So I think one good initiative in Singapore is the SG Women in Tech Relaunch Initiative, which was done together in collaboration with IMDA and NTUC Learning Hub, that combines kind of like the AI upskilling, mentoring, and job matching to help women to re-enter tech. So if you could use that model to work together and provide flexible kind of training for especially women with caregiving responsibilities, you could help try to bridge that gap little by little. Yeah.
Super interesting. In the interest of time, I might jump to the next issue, actually. Okay. So in our study as well, we also looked at scams as another kind of dimension or an artifact of this kind of movement of people online and the different demographic groups moving online as part of digitalization. And one of the really interesting results that mirrors what's been reported by SPF and the Ministry of Home Affairs as well is that government impersonation scams are a kind of one of the most commonplace forms in Singapore. And that's probably due to, a degree of high level of trust in government that's very unique to Singapore. But Jason, I just wanted to ask you a question about this. There's also been some discussion about the kind of intersection of things like AI and scams as a kind of movement. How can and how has the law really dealt with these kinds of complex intersections between different issues and technologies? Say, for example, the use of AI and generative AI technologies in scams, particularly in this kind of social context.
So, yeah, full disclosure, I'm not exactly sure. But I think that means it probably hasn't dealt with it adequately. Yeah. I know that in Australia, I recently was home and listening to, parliamentary question time, and Prime Minister Albanese was talking about this very issue and the fact that scam hits have been basically doubling every year in Australia for the last 3 or 4 years. And it's a multi-billion-dollar sort of a reported damage hit annually, and we suspect there's a lot more that goes unreported because it's really quite embarrassing to be the victim of a scam. I think the problem is that we're dealing with a situation using domestic regulatory levers and law enforcement measures, but there is also a cross-border sort of a problem. We know that there are, basically farms of very unfortunate people who are, sort of locked in a room and are scamming 12 hours a day against the clock in certain jurisdictions. And there are going to be aspects of the problem that are actually just difficult, if not impossible, to really deal with domestically. I mean, obviously, we could try to sharpen things like, access to a local mobile phone number, or dodgy URLs or something. But the nature of it is you're always playing whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
I think, probably the levers are not going to be only regulatory and enforcement related, but also educational.
Hmm.
And I think expectations and sort of citizen expectations. Years ago, I had a student from Malaysia, and in Australia, he was stung with a dog-based scam where he
Hmm.
got insurance and paid for a puppy. The puppy didn't exist, and he didn't realize until the money was in Cameroon with Western Union that he'd been stung. And he said to me, in Malaysia, I would have known that this was fishy, and I never would have fallen for it. But I thought in
Yeah.
Australia things were like, pretty hunky-dory. And the woman sent me a passport and so forth. Well, it wasn't a woman, and it wasn't her passport, it was a stolen identity. So I think expectations, and that's where, the background high levels of trust in government in Singapore, which is a wonderful and a very, very good thing. So tools for verification. And of course the education campaign, which the Singapore government agencies are already pursuing around being scam aware, I think is quite useful.
Yeah, that when the kind of actors domestically link with some of those foreign actors, and the domestic actors have a very nuanced understanding of the population,
Yeah.
and the sort of manipulation lever that they can
Yes.
pull, it becomes much more
Yeah.
damaging. And the
Yeah.
cross-border issue, as you say, is incredibly difficult. Okay, I just wanted to move on again to one of the socio-demographic issues that we talked about before. And one of the other dimensions that we talked about, Jason, you gave the example of your mother. I think I've been in the same situation where my parents have started using technology. The inverse of that is clearly that our young people, our digital natives, are, the early adopters of AI technology and platforms in many cases, and are responsible for some of these kinds of trends in usage and the kind of patterns that we have. Kind of coming to the fore in terms of chatbot use and so on and so forth. So Nigel, looking forward, what implications do you think that has for online safety? So what are the sorts of online harms that we should keep an eye out for in terms of that particular group? I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I think just looking as a whole, we know from our prevalence study previously that youths are more likely to experience online harms. But just for the focus, and also to just kind of put our focus on what's of key importance on my mind recently, is to know that we need to look at them also not only as survivors of online harms, but also at sometimes offenders, right? Or at least perhaps not really offenders, but at times they do misuse, because while they are quick to adopt and experiment these tools, like Gen AI tools or the first adopters of new tech, they may not have the necessary knowledge, maturity, or ethical grounding to fully understand the implications of how to use these tools, or even fully understand the impacts they have on others.
Yeah.
So we are seeing cases as well of how some of these youths are using Gen AI to generate fake screenshots of their classmates as a joke, or deep fake videos or voice clones to ridicule peers, some to the extent of sexually explicit material, and to amplify bullying and spread misinformation. But the challenge really is that I don't necessarily think that these youths intend serious harm. They probably think of it as a joke, or trying to kind of fit in with the in crowd. But the impact can be tremendous. Sometimes the things that we put on the internet never really leave the internet, right? So how we respond to these cases matter. We don't need to think just about punitive kind of measures, right? We need a certain form of accountability, but we also need a certain form of restorative methods and approaches, because we recognize that these youths are learning and trying to develop their moral compass. So as we look at this online space and we think about online harms, we also need to think about how we address it when the offender is of a younger age, right? So do we want to do digital ethics education? Do we want peer accountability programs and safe spaces for them for reflection and repentance and reparation, sorry? So we really need to think a lot more about this, right, moving forward.
The interesting dimension there is because of that naivete as well, they kind of test the guardrails of some of this technology and find these gray spaces that are underregulated and that are potentially ripe for misuse as well. So, Jason, we mentioned Australia. Full disclosure, we're both Australians, obviously, as people can tell from our accents. And obviously, Australia, the world's watching Australia, and there have been several remarks from PM Wong and otherwise about this, about watching the social media ban for young people. And in recent times, like in the last week alone, eSafety has taken many strong moves to clamp down on chatbot use and use of pernicious apps. Mm. What do we look out for there? Because everyone, yes, the natural response is let's look to Australia and see what happens. But what do we look out for? What should we look out for? What are the signs or signals of efficacy or backfires that we need to watch for in this space, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And sometimes I wish that it were a much larger jurisdiction that was making a move like this, because I think the problem, the challenge is that when you're a small jurisdiction, you don't necessarily have the leverage to convince a platform owner to redesign its platform. And so compliance issues, I mean, yeah, you can geo-block functions and all these sorts of things. So I think that would be a success criterion. You know, are there changes to the platforms that we're concerned about that sort of meaningfully enhance the efficacy of the ban? I think obviously circumvention, like if kids are just managing to circumvent and get around the requirements, especially if they're aided by their parents, if they're like, well, you know, I'll turn the, you know, I'll give my parental approval, or I'll do whatever. I think we would be wanting to look for empirical evidence which, you know, will emerge over the coming months and years about, you know, harm levels. Have harm levels meaningfully been changed? And that might be, you know, evidence of sexploitation or those sorts of things. It might also be reflected in mental health sort of outcomes. We know that since the infinite scroll was introduced to you know, starting with I think Facebook in about 2012, there's a correlation. We haven't proved that it's causative, but there's a correlation with a steep decline in young people's mental health outcomes. Are youth migrating to sort of darker parts of the web? That would be something, again, maybe difficult to measure, but I think would be an important signal. And, you know, something that probably some colleagues of mine are more concerned about than I am, because but trust erosion and sort of a counterculture backlash among young people as well. If young people are really bristling against this and see it as an impingement on, you know, their rightful autonomy or what have you, that would probably be a signal, if I were a regulator or a policy maker, that maybe a more nuanced approach would just be more productive.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. It's a very nuanced conversation, isn't it, about banning versus adapting feature set, or, you know, co-creating different kinds of solutions. The thing I always think about as well is, you know, some of the kind of other laws that we can look towards, or other, you know, policy perspectives, are things like in Australia at the moment, the excise on tobacco to make it harder for people to smoke have then pushed black market, which is similar to what you're talking about there, where if we ban this kind of technology, where do people go? Where do they migrate to? And is it worse? That kind of consideration of some of those backfire effects is very, very critical. The other dimension that I think is really interesting is what the actual platforms do about it, because 4chan I don't know if you saw this, but 4chan recently launched a case against Ofcom, claiming that it's suppressing free speech, which is another interesting dimension. Okay, so on to the next topic, and another of the key issues really highlighted by our survey is the potential for this emotional reliance upon chatbots. And indeed, when, you know, OpenAI ChatGPT 4.0 was switched off for a while, you get a lot of people complaining about that, partly because of the reliance more generally, but also upon this emotional reliance. And perhaps one of the most interesting results for me in this survey was that there are particularly vulnerable groups, such as people with disabilities, who are relying on chatbots for emotional counsel. So, Jason, I just wanted to start off with you on this one. So we've seen obviously a lot going on in this space from a legal perspective. So things like the character AI case in the United States. How can law or regulation really protect against harms stemming from this kind of emotional dependence? And how do we stay ahead of groups becoming emotionally dependent before we even realize it?
Yeah. So I think there's probably, there's likely to be a gradient of emotional dependence, and the seriousness of it is going to depend on where we are on that gradient. My suspicion is that emotional dependence is probably a much larger sort of phenomenon than we're aware of. And I mean, even for example, in the survey, that's a really useful data point, but it's kind of asking someone, are you an alcoholic? A lot of people are not going to report truthfully. Whereas they may indeed be emotionally dependent on this or that. And again, I have anecdotes. I've spoken to friends who work in this area who, a mother who's recently widowed or a dad who's recently retired, and they do a lot with their chatbot. They take photos of the wardrobe and it gives them fashion advice, and they find their recipes through it, and they're spending a lot of time interacting. I think where we have to start, which is just the no-brainer, is pretty clear regulation, and maybe even some sort of standards or some way of making that regulation meaningful at the user interface and technical layer in sensitive contexts, like, for example, mental health chatbots. And I can recall it was an early case, and the name of it slips me now, but it was a young Belgian man who'd been, I think, having depression, availed himself of the services of a chatbot, and it had basically fed into his sort of neurosis and actively encouraged him to commit suicide, which unfortunately he did. So, where you have tech companies actively soliciting users among vulnerable population groups for use cases like this, I think that's a pretty clear context where we need some sort of regulatory or therapeutic. It's difficult. Is it a good? Is it a service? It is but we need some sort of clear response which reflects the sensitive, therapeutic, sort of paraprofessional nature of the use case. So I'd love to see more generally, though, measures that might include regulatory measures to tackle more broadly the addictive nature of social media, and increasingly, we'll see AI-driven social media sort of functionalities, even before they get to the manipulative or the exploitative, because I think that addictive user interface design is a large part, is sort of the root of the problem. And we take a similar approach with other addictive substances. And with addictive behaviors such as gambling. We might even impose a duty of care or something where some sort of dependence is foreseeable with negative consequences. But I don't think that it's an easy regulatory puzzle. It's probably also going to be one in which we need some development of various private law doctrines, and in which law might not give us a completely satisfactory sort of an answer.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? In a world where, an online space where there are aspirations to make it completely frictionless, actually that friction serves us very, very well. Nigel, what are your takes on that in terms of that kind of emotional reliance dimension?
Yeah, I really do agree with Jason's last point, that legal frameworks are really essential, but they are not enough, and they're usually supplemented by other areas. I think when we look at emerging research coming up from even the work done by OpenAI and MIT labs to explore who really uses the effective queues and effective users of ChatGPT, right? The users that turn to them the most are those that are lonely, are socially disconnected, and they represent a bigger epidemic that's happening around the world of loneliness and social disconnection, which is quite ironic how connected we are in the digital aspect, right? So if we don't really address that root cause of loneliness, or especially the social disconnect that youths who have been kind of reported across many regional studies to be the age group with the highest kind of proportion of loneliness, then they will always find ways to circumvent it in different means and measures. So I guess the kinds of things that we need to think about supporting these regulations are to provide meaningful alternatives to kind of foster that connection among people, especially youths. So when we think about the local setting, I think Friend Zone, a nonprofit group that kind of like promotes neighborhood as well as different youth groups of work opportunities for them to bond, may be an aspect, maybe kind of an initiative that may help as we think about putting in regulations that help kind of prevent this kind of affective addiction, as it were.
Great. Okay, the last thing I just want to touch on is the next steps and how we work better together. So obviously this kind of speed of technological evolution, generative AI, associated technologies in that space is only going to increase from here on out, not only because of the kind of international, from the geopolitical dimension, the arms race that's going on there, but also the technological arms race at a company level too, where you see this kind of transmission of different staff and being paid huge amounts from say migration from OpenAI to Meta and so on and so forth. How do we ensure that different stakeholders work together to try to move to an online space, an online future that is safer by design? Jason, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, not an easy question, Rob. I think I'm grateful that I had an analog childhood. I mean, obviously, I love technology. I have dedicated my career to it and think about it, all the time. But I'm really grateful that I had an analog childhood. And now that I've got a toddler myself, I also feel like a significant sense of responsibility on our generation as the last ones. I assume we're all about the same age. I'm 42. That I feel a significant sense of responsibility as the last people. In a few years, we'll be the last people alive who remembered having an analog childhood, which is a little bit frightening. So I think that we need to pose some uncomfortable questions, and this is why I think this whole panel or this whole discussion that we've had, it's about Gen AI, it's about social media, but it's about digitalization more broadly. We're committed to this project of digital transformation of society thoroughly, top to bottom, left to right. We also have a narrative of inevitability, like it's going to happen whether we like it or not. It seems, too late to turn back the tide. But we do need to think about effective interventions that we can and should make to mitigate some of these clear areas where, for example, the fact that our young people are lonely and anxious and depressed, we're in a world saturated by social media where the whole rhetoric is about bringing people together and forming communities, is a sorry indictment of what we've been doing for the last 15 years. And it's our problem because it's happened on our watch. So it sounds cliche, but it is a whole of society task. We do need to think and ask ourselves some uncomfortable questions about digitalization and what it means to be committed to a thoroughgoing project of digital transformation of society in all of its aspects. And that sort of, involves shifting the narrative a little bit. I think it's not realistic to expect model or platform or application providers to solve this on their own. That is, I know that also Singapore's regulatory preferences for a light touch, collaborative industry government sort of effort. And to a large extent, I'm actually on board with that. But I think, we do need to be pretty muscular about what we expect. I think, we need to take the lesson from the last 15 years of social media. It hasn't gone well on anybody's reckoning. and we need to make sure that, you know, we course correct. In particular around this intersection of Gen AI and the attention economy. Your point about by design thinking is crucial. So as a law professor and universities being an important civil society sort of institution, this is why I spend lots of my time doing this kind of thing, talking to the policy community. We do lots of outreach with industry, including with sort of the bad guys. And we really lean into those relationships because there's lots of great people working in those organizations. But they don't necessarily have an easy job because there are clear financial imperatives. So, you know, organizations like SA, like She is another example, and even Verian, you know, providing better evidence bases on which to make these sorts of decisions. So I don't actually have a clear model in mind, you know, especially because a lot of the problem technologies are coming from the private sector. And every sort of easy fix that we have is going to be subject to gaming, both by users and by providers. So regulation certainly is going to form part of it. But I think there's a broader social and cultural shift that needs to happen too. And that involves, I think, putting some uncomfortable truths on the table and taking an accurate stock take of where we are.
Thank you. Great answer. Nigel.
Yeah, I think I really am on board with whatever Jason is talking about. I primarily feel that all these dialogues should then be operationalized as a shared code of conduct. These dialogues must reach somewhere, but we must understand everybody's position, where they're at, the considerations they have, so that it can be a living framework that would guide ethical behavior and safety standards. Really accountability across all sectors, not only just the big bets or so as it seems, but really how can we help each other to achieve certain kind of commitments to, for example, relevant amount of information for transparency in AI systems, how they're created, the idea of inclusive design practices. We talked a bit about gender adoption and how we can help with that, protection of vulnerable groups, not only youths, not only women, but maybe seniors as well, and those that are not talked about today, responsible data use, and mechanisms of redress and feedback. But these conversations will be hard. And getting people on the table may not be as easy as it always seems. But I think there probably are enough stakeholders across the sectors that would be interested in such conversations. And hopefully in the years to come, we will see such kind of movements moving forward. Yeah.
Thanks, gentlemen. Great answers, great discussion. Thank you so much for taking your time out today to have this chat. Just as a last note, where can we hear more about what you're doing? Are there any like spruiks that you want to do before we wrap up today?
Definitely.
Jason.
All right,
Yeah.
definitely. So yeah, you can Center for Digital Law. So if you Google SMU CDL, we've got a website which gives further information about some of the research projects we've got ongoing. Some of the my faculty colleagues. We have a pretty active event schedule. And many of those, some of them are kind of very academic-y. A lot of them, though, we're really trying to, dedicate quite a chunk of our time and effort to, convening what we call trilogues between, academia, industry, and the policy community. And we do have some public outreach kind of events as well. So if there are areas of interest, then yeah, our contact details are all online. Get in touch. And we always love to hear actually from different stakeholders what their concerns are, and we do try to feed that into our research agenda, so that we're doing research that matters for Singapore and the world more broadly.
Cool. How about you, Nigel?
Thanks. I think for us, you can just sign up for our organization's mailing list or drop us an email to explore collaboration on the work that maybe we can try to find space to do together at our homepage at www.she.org.sg. But thank you so much for inviting us. It's a really very exciting panel.
Okay, so thank you everyone for your time and attention this Wednesday morning. I'd like to just once again thank our esteemed panelists, Professor Jason and Nigel, and of course, our wonderful presenters, Amy and Denise. I do hope that this session was useful and thought-provoking and sparked some ideas about the sorts of policies or interventions that could be useful or might be required moving forward to ensure that digitalization and Singapore's agenda for rapid digitalization works for everyone and keeps everyone safe. So on screen, you can see our contact details. If you would like any more information on the survey that we ran, we had lots more results that we couldn't, unfortunately, squeeze into today's session. Do drop us an email and we can organize a follow-up session with you individually. But for now, again, I would just like to thank you all, and we hope to see you next year for our Decoding X event. Thank you very much.